Hey y'all, in this video we're going to get back into 3D carving and start getting a little bit more advanced this time. So let's jump right in. We'll go ahead and we'll create a new file. This will be a single-sided job. I'm going to stick with my standard dimension of 12 inches wide in X, 12 inches high in Y, and a nominal Z thickness of 3/4 of an inch. We'll set our Z0 position to the material surface, and for layout purposes we'll set our XY datum position to the center. To get this set up, I'm going to just go ahead and use a very high 7 times slower modeling resolution. I'll go ahead and accept this, and we'll get started. So once again, I'm going to be using models that are provided in the 3D Clipart that comes with VCarve and Aspire. This time I want to combine a couple of models. So we'll go up here to our Clipart folder, and again I'm going to look for a dome/dish. Except this time I think I want one with a flat bottom. So I'm going to choose this one here, this circle, and again to put it in the center of my material out here, I'll just come over here and double click it. Okay, so when you're combining models, it's best to get the first model, the model that's going to be on the bottom, set and ready to go first. Then we can come back and add more models to our project out here. So with my model already in move and transform mode out here in the center of my material, let's go ahead and resize it. Again, I want about a 10-inch diameter circle out here. So I'll make sure I have link XY checked here. Then I can choose either one, it doesn't matter because it's linked. I'll select my width in X and I'll enter 10.0. Click apply, and our model resizes out here. We can go ahead and close that. Now again, if we come over here in the 3D view and take a look, we have a dome. So we need to go back and change that. So we'll go over here into my 2D view, making sure the model is selected. We'll come down here to the modeling tab. And again, I have flat round circle, and the combine mode you see is set upwards. We need to change that. So I can double click on the name of this model down here, or I can come up and click on this wrench. Either one will do. And that gives me the properties of this model. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set this as our base. I'll go ahead and select the downward combine, and if you notice, turned almost all of the model black out here. Before it was white and just black around the edges, and you see the gradient here. It starts out black and then comes up lighter and lighter until it gets to white. That is showing you the black is the deepest cut it's going to make. The white is the shallowest cut. Well, when we change that over to subtraction instead of addition, it does just the opposite. We have black here, meaning this is going to be the deepest part of the cut, and we go gradually lighter until we get out here, and this will be the shallowest edge of the cut. Okay, just something to let you see how the model is set just at a glance. I can see out here with this big black circle that this is going to carve into the material. It's not going to carve this away. Okay, we take a look at our 3D view to confirm, And sure enough, there is the model. Now, I had a couple of questions based on the last video asking about the zero plane. If we zoom in here on our model, take a look, we can see we've got some pretty rough edges in the model itself. If we don't use a zero plane, those rough edges will be carved into the material. If you've been having problems with chip out or big lines around your models, that could be a factor. The zero plane eliminates that. But I'll get into that a little further in a minute. As we have it set right now, if we look down here at the XYZ display, this model is going to cut 0.4514 deep. That's a little bit deep for me. I want to bring that down to about 3/8 of an inch. My material is 3/4 of an inch. I want to bring it down to about half of that depth. So we'll go up here in the shape height and we'll enter 0.375. That you see adjusted the model. We come here and we look, it's a little bit shallower. And I run my cursor out here and I look down at my XYZ display and I see it's now carving 3/8 of an inch deep. Now we still have that roughness around the edge, but again the zero plane will take care of that. But before we do a zero plane, we have a couple of other things we want to add to this project. So we can go ahead and close this. I'd like to give this as a wedding gift. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll import another model right here into the center. So we'll go back to our Clipart. And I'm going to jump down here to Objects and People. And we'll just scroll down the list of models that we have here till I come across the wedding rings. And I think that would look good carved into the center of this. So again, I'll double click to put those rings in the center. And if I'm on that, may be a little bit small, so I'm going to bring, because we're automatically in move and transform mode, I'm going to go ahead and bring my cursor over to one of these corner boxes and hold down Shift to lock that model in the center of my material. Just kind of drag it out a little bit, make it a little bit bigger here. I think that's about enough. I think that looks much better. So I'm finished with my modeling or Clipart tab. I can go back over here and we'll kind of take a look and see what we've got. We can see here our 3D model for the dish kind of sits below, it's carving into the top of this piece of material. But if we come up here and look at this in X or Y, I'll go ahead and just do a straight on X shot. We can see that these wedding rings stand proud of the material. That's not going to work at all. So we're going to need to change the properties on this model completely. So with it selected, we'll go back into the modeling tab. And we see now here on level 1 we have added the wedding rings along with the flat round circle. Let's open up the properties on the wedding rings by double clicking it. Now in this case we do want the combine mode to be addition. We want these wedding rings to stand proud of our dish. We just don't want them to stand that proud. So we can see right here that we have a shape height of 0.3678. That is from this edge here, let me zoom in a bit, from this edge here where the straight vertical meets the top of the model, that's how thick this is. This straight edge and everything below it is the base of the model, and this is the relief of the model. So the shape height is this portion up here above. That's a little bit much. Our base height is a little bit much as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce this a little bit. Let's take it down to about 1/8 of an inch and see how that looks. So we'll take 1, 2, 5 and let it update. That brings that down quite a bit, but our base is still a little bit high. I don't want this tall base standing up before we get to the actual contour of the model. I want to get rid of quite a bit of that. So I have two ways of doing that. One, I can enter a number up here in base height if I know it, or I can adjust the slider. Now, this slider we see moving to the right will give us positive numbers, which will raise the model up, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to have to go into negative numbers here and bring that base height down. So let's see what happens when we move it down to about 0.3. Take a look at that, and that brings that down some. It's now below the level of the surface of our model here, but I still have quite a bit of a ridge. So we've tried -3, let's try -3.5. Let it update, see what we get there. That's a, whoops, didn't mean to move it. Control Z. There. That's a little bit better. Let's see what happens if we take it all the way down to 0.375. Let it update. Looking at it from this direction here, we do have a little bit of a ridge here, but since this ring is supposed to be laying on top of this one, that actually doesn't look bad. The lowest ring, we still have some relief here, but not a huge amount. So I think that'll work. We'll go ahead and reduce our base height to -375. I'll leave the shape height at 0.125. What all this means is the start of the contours of the model will start at the surface of the dish model. And the relief, the height of the model itself at its highest point, will be about 1/8 of an inch above. Now, with this recess down inside this model here, we can bring this up if we like and see how that looks. And I don't know that I like that. I don't know, just personal taste. I think I prefer it back down at 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to use that just for me. Again, this is one of those subjective things. If you want more depth, more contour on the rings, then by all means adjust that shape height right here. I'll go ahead and close this. And now let's take a look at what we have here in Z, and I'll give you a brief recap. What we did was we imported a dome/dish. We got into the properties. We set it as a dish to carve down into the material. Then we imported the wedding rings. We adjusted our base height to where the relief of the model starts right here at the level of this dish. Then we adjusted the relief height to give us what we're looking for here. Enough contour here to make it stand out, but not so much that it looks like it's projecting out from the wall. So we can go ahead and close this. Before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and calculate toolpath to show you what this looks like without a zero plane. Because again, we still have this roughness here that came modeled in with this dish model. So what I'll do is I'll come over here and just do a 3D finishing toolpath. I'm going to do it real quick with a 1/4 inch ball nose bit. Do the model boundary, calculate, and I'm just doing this to be fast so that we don't spend a lot of time waiting for this to calculate. And I'll preview that toolpath. And already, even though it's just beginning, you can see what I mean about the roughness of that model and how it's going to carve along the edges. And that's simply because VCarve does not have a reference as to where this model is supposed to start Now, in a situation like this where I don't want to continue watching the preview, I can stop the preview by coming down here to the bottom of my screen and hitting this red X right here. That stops the preview. I don't have to wait for this to go ahead and finish to do what I want to do next. I don't like this. I need to get rid of this. So what I'll do is reset my preview, close my preview window, and I'm going to delete that toolpath entirely by right-clicking, selecting delete, and then selecting delete this. And that eliminates that toolpath. So, as you've guessed, we still have some work to do out here. Looking at my 2D view now, I have both models placed exactly where I want them. But what I want to do now is I want to add that zero plane. So we'll add the zero plane. We don't see any difference here, but if we go into the 3D view, now is when we do see the difference. What adding that zero plane did was filled in where the model stops. It filled it into the surface of our material. Now, one side effect of this, if you noticed in the first video in this series, is it makes the entire surface our 3D model. And I'll explain that a little bit further when we get into calculating toolpaths for this. What we have now is our zero plane, our wedding rings, and our flat round circle. They're all placed, and we could carve this as is. But I think we need something, I think we need a little bit more. So, go ahead and go back to a straight Z view. I'll go back into my 2D view, and I'll go back into my drawing tab. Now I'm going to click off out here just to deselect everything, and you see how everything kind of went grayish. I want to put a vector around this dish to base an offset on. I want to offset out away from this model to give me a vector to cut as a profile. And there's a very simple way of doing this. I'll select this model, go back over into my modeling tab, and then come up here to the third icon on the left, which is create a vector boundary around the selected component. I'll click that icon, and if we zoom in here, we now see that there is a vector around the model that I can select. I can go back over to my drawing tab, and if I wanted to just cut flush around the model, that's the vector that I would use for my profile toolpath. Well, I want a little bit of a lip out here. I want a rim. I don't want that sharp jagged edge where that dish would end if I just cut right here along this vector. So, with that vector selected, I'm going to offset. So I'll come over here and click offset. I want to offset it outwards. And I want a rim out here. Let's go with a 3/8 of an inch wide rim out here. So I'll offset outwards 0.375. I don't have any sharp offset corners to worry about, so it doesn't matter if there's a check mark in there or not. I don't want to delete the original. I don't want to select the new vector. I just want to create the new vector. And there it is when I click offset. There's our new vector. Now I'll close that. Now I want to do something else. I want to put some text in here. I want to put the names of the bride and groom up here and the date of their wedding down here. And I want it to curve. I want the text to follow a curve. Probably the first thing I want to do is create the curves that I want the text to follow, simply because it'll be easier without the text here in the way. So, without selecting anything, I'll just click off and come over here under Create Vectors to draw a circle. Now I want the center point of that circle to be at my x0, y0. And I already have a diameter of 7 inches here on a 10-inch dish. Let's create it and see what it looks like. Okay, that kind of blends in there. Let's make that a little bit bigger. So I will hit Control Z to undo that circle. And we'll make it 7.5 inches in diameter. Click Create. And now my circle doesn't lay over the rings, either one of them. So I think I'll go with that. I'll close that. Now I want to split this circle into 2 arcs. One going this way, one going this way. So I'll click on the circle, and then I'm going to go into node editing mode by typing the letter N on my keyboard. And that takes us into node editing. And we see that this circle is made up of 4 arcs. I'm going to bring my cursor over this point right here, right click, and select Cut Vector. But before I do, we look over here, we see the letter C. That's the keyboard shortcut to cut vectors. So I'll select this one now since I have the menu open. And we'll see the start point change to that point right there. Remember, green is the start point. Black is just any other point. Well, now I want to cut the vector over here, and since I now know the keyboard shortcut, I can just put my cursor over that vector or over that point, and when it turns into the crosshairs, just type the letter C, and the vector is cut. So now I have these 3 points showing me this arc up here. I can come down here and click on this, and I have these 3 points showing me that this arc is separate from this one. So I now have 2 open vectors. So click off to deselect, right click to come out of node editing mode. Now I'm ready to add some text. So we'll go up here to my text window and click on that icon. Give it a second to load the fonts. And I'm going to go a little traditional. I'm going to stick with my Times New Roman. I'll figure out my text height in a minute. It doesn't really matter where out here it's going to place the text because I'm going to be moving it. So we'll go ahead and come up here and enter the names, which are Frankie and Johnny. The right people will get that. and I'll close it. Now I can click again my text to bring it into move and transform mode, and I'm going to grab it by the center block here and move it up and line that center block. You see how it snaps to the middle, and I want to put it right there on that intersection. So my text is now snapped right there to the center of that arc. So now I can click off. Then again select my text, hold down Shift and select this arc. Select the arc last. Then I'll come over here under Create Vectors to this icon right here. Wrap text along a curve. I'll click that icon and we have a couple of problems. So let me close that, do Control Z to undo that, and I'll show you why this flipped upside down and reversed. And that has to do with the vector start point of this arc. With that arc selected, again I'll type N on my keyboard to go into node editing, and we see the vector start point is over here. We read and write left to right, not right to left. So I'll want my start point to be over here. The text is going to follow this arc based on the start point. So I'll convert this, right click, make start point. That changes green. While I have this open, let's check the bottom one. It's the same way. So I'll go ahead and hover over this, right click, make start point. So now both of these arcs are running from left to right. Click off, and then right click to get out of node editing mode. Now I can select my text, hold down Shift, select the arc, come back over here to apply text on a curve, click it, and we stay oriented the correct way. Now we have some decisions to make here. I don't really like how this is sitting. So I'll go ahead and maintain the text size, but first of all we need to do some placing here. I want the text to be aligned to the center of that arc. So I'll click middle, and that places it there. I don't really like the letters staying vertical, so I'll come down here and click Align to Curve. That adjusts that much nicer. It's sitting on top of this vector, on top of our arc. Now we can position it above the curve where it is now, we can place it on the curve, or we can place it below the curve. Let's take a look at what happens if we place it on the curve. And that's going to put some of my lettering down here in the ring, and I don't want that. So let's go above the curve. And maybe we'll revisit this, maybe we won't. But we're going to leave that as is right now until we get the date here, then we can make adjustments. We'll close that, click off to deselect. Now I want to get the date entered down below, so I'll go back to my text window and I'll type March 21st, next year, 2020. That'll work. We got advance notice. Again, I'm going to leave all this alone because it doesn't really matter yet. We'll just close it. And then it's already selected, so I'll click it again to bring me into move and transform mode. Grab the center of my text, drag it down here and snap it to that intersection. Now I can click off, select the text, hold down Shift, select the arc, and it's important to do it in that order because the apply text to a curve applies the text to the last curve you click, the last vector you select. So we'll apply text to a curve, and again we have to go back through and make those adjustments. We want to align the text to the center of that arc. I want to align it to the curve, but this one is placed so far up there we are into the rings way too much. Let's look at below the curve, and that brings it out here quite a bit. We're kind of getting into a little bit of the slope that may be too much, but we'll take a look at it and see what it looks like. I certainly don't want to do it on the curve because that's going to engrave again in those rings. So we'll look at below the curve. We'll go ahead and close, deselect everything. With our text placed, we no longer need these two vectors here. So we can go ahead and select them both, delete. Now we're free to adjust these should we want to. If I want to move these down just slightly, I can just select them and then using my cursor down button on the keyboard, kind of nudge it a little bit to bring it out of our 3D carve area up here. And it's the same thing with this. I can select it and using the cursor up button on my keyboard, I can nudge it up just slightly. I think that may be a little much. So let me zoom in a little bit. Yeah, I think that'll work. That'll work. I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Click off to deselect everything. So now we need to take the time to go back and look at our text and see do we need to make any more adjustments. Now, as I look at this, I think the N and the K are just a little bit too close together. And when we try to carve this, they're going to run into one another. So I can adjust the spacing by coming over here to Edit Text Spacing and Curve. Click on that icon. Come back over here between the N and the K. And if you look at my cursor now, you see a V with an arrow, then an arrow, then an A. You see which way those arrows are pointing. If I click now, that's going to move those two letters together. If I hold down Shift, you see the arrows change direction. I can click between these two letters to return it to where it was, then click once more to kind of spread them apart a little bit. And I think that will work. I think that's far enough. This might get a little bit further apart. And we'll come back over here and take a look, and these two ends are a little close together. So I'll hold down Shift, click, come between the N and the H, hold down Shift, click. That separates those letters just enough to where the feet here are not going to run into one another, but it all looks like the same word still. So we're good there. Let's take a look down here. We've got plenty of spacing up here between our letters. We're just fine. So I'm not going to bother with that at all. So to get out of this mode and back into selection, I'll come over here under Edit Objects to this first icon here, go back into selection mode. And that gives me my plane arrow. So now we're ready to start calculating toolpaths. We've got a pretty complex design here. We've got our dome which we changed over to a dish. We have the rings that are going to be left in relief, carved on the bottom of that dish. We've got text to apply to that dish. Then we have our profile out here so we can cut it free of the rest of our material. So let's start calculating some toolpaths. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the rings, hold down Shift, select the dish. Go over here to our Toolpath tab, and again I'm going to use a roughing toolpath with a 1/4 inch ball nose. I'm going to select the model boundary, and remember what's going to happen is it's going to change, that zero plane changes the entire piece of material is now the model boundary. I'm not going to use a boundary offset for this. It's just not necessary. If I apply a boundary offset, it would make my ball nose run 1/4 inch past the edge of my material. And I don't need it to do that because I'm cutting it out. I'm going to leave a machining allowance of 25 thousandths of an inch. I had a question on my previous video about why on my roughing toolpath did the Z come down and just cut to a certain level, drop a little more, cut to a certain level, drop a little more, and cut to a certain level. That's because I was using the Z level roughing strategy. If I want to carve out the entire dish and rings with my roughing strategy, I will use 3D raster. I want it to run side to side in this direction to go with the grain of the material on the machine. So I'll raster along the X. If my grain of my material ran up and down, I would change that to raster along Y. My grain runs this way and I want to carve with the grain as much as possible, so I'm going to 3D raster along X. The choice between 3D raster and Z level is your choice to make. As I demonstrated in the previous video, Z level roughing strategy, the bit will drop down to a certain point, machine away the entire area, leaving only the areas behind that the finishing toolpath will clean up. Then drop to the next level, do the same. Drop to the next level, do the same. 3D raster, the Z will plunge down as deep as it needs on each pass to leave that 25 thousandths machining allowance. If you have a long enough cutting area on your bit, 3D raster may help. If you don't, use Z level. We're going to come on down here and call this 3D roughing 1. We'll just leave that name. Now calculate. Now again, because I'm using that lower resolution, it doesn't take as long. So, as you can see, again, the zero plane turned the entire piece of material into part of the 3D model. So we'll go ahead and we'll preview this toolpath. We begin to see the rings show up. You see my step over is pretty wide, which leaves all of those ridges. Most of them will be eliminated with the finishing toolpath. The number of passes it's going to take to rough out the entire model is totally dependent on the pass depth that you have set for the bit. You just saw this took 2 passes to clean this out. That's because the pass depth for that bit was not enough to clean out the 0.35 inches that it took to carve this whole thing out. So we have it roughed out. We'll close our preview and go straight over to 3D finishing. Now I'm going to run this one with an 1/8 inch ball nose end mill, and I'm going to look at my step over. My step over is at 40%. I'm going to leave that here in this window, click OK, but immediately go over to Edit, and I'm going to select, I'm going to enter 9%, 9.0%. The reason I want to do that here is because modifying the step over in the Edit window applies that modification to this toolpath only. When I calculate this toolpath, if I want to do something else with that bit, it will be at the previous step over of 40%. It doesn't modify the bit for good, only for this toolpath. I'm not going to use a boundary offset, 0.0, and I'm going to use a raster strategy with a raster angle of 0, meaning the bit's going to go back and forth with the grain of my material. I'll go ahead and calculate, and this is going to take a little bit to do. We see how long this takes at this resolution. Imagine setting it to 50 times slower. There we go. Now you see how tight that is. That's 100% solid blue. You have to zoom in quite a bit to see the individual passes. At this resolution, you see why 3D carving takes so long. So we'll go ahead and we'll preview that toolpath. And there we go. So now we can zoom in and see it cleaned it up fairly well. Maybe a touch of sanding will be needed here and there, but it shouldn't be much at all. And that's at lower resolution. I like that. I think I'm going to leave it that way. We have those taken care of. Now let's go back into our 2D view. Not only can we not see our text, we can't see anything but those two models. So we'll just click off out here. There's our text. I'll select this text here, hold down Shift, select this text here, and we'll do a VCarve toolpath. The starting depth will be 0. I'm not going to carve to a flat depth. I am going to try it with the 90-degree V-bit and see what it looks like. I can always come back and change it if I don't like it. Here is the important setting to use. And that is this right down here. Project toolpath onto 3D model. What this does is it projects all of this text down to the bottom of this dish. And if the top of these letters happen to be in any of the carved areas, it will project it down into that carving as well. Same thing down here. We have the comma. It's going to wrap into that dish a little bit, into that curve of the dish. This will project that toolpath down into the bottom of the model. We'll go ahead and calculate. It's just a standard VCarve toolpath, so it calculates very quickly. I have it selected. I'm going to change my toolpath color to black so that you can see it. Then I'll preview that toolpath. There we go. If we zoom in, kind of angle it here, kind of drag it back up this way, we can see we got a nice clean carve. I don't think I need to change that to a different bit. I think the size that we're using here is just fine. So I think I'll use that just as is. So now with that done, the last thing we have to do, close this, go into our 2D view, and select our outside profile. For this, we'll just select Profile Toolpath. My start depth is going to be 0. I want to start carving at the surface. I want it to cut all the way through the material and just a little bit beyond to make sure it does get all the way through. So I'll type for my cut depth. I'll eliminate everything in that box and I'll type Z plus 0.005, meaning it's going to take the Z thickness I entered over here in Job Setup and add 0.005 of an inch to it. Then when I press the equals button on my keyboard, I get my cut depth. Tool I'm going to use is a 1/4 inch end mill. That's okay. 6 passes. That's okay. I want it to cut to the outside of that vector. I am going to do a separate last pass with an allowance of 0.01. I'm not going to add tabs yet, and I'll show you why in just a minute. I'm not going to ramp. I have no sharp corners to worry about. I'll go ahead and hit Calculate. You'll notice I'm not projecting the toolpath onto the 3D model. We're cutting outside of the model. That's not necessary. I'll just calculate the toolpath. It's warning me that the tool will cut through the material. I want it to. Then we'll preview that toolpath. Now I'm going to change up, because I'm not really much for this light colored material. I'm going to change it to a medium color. There we go. That looks a little better. And here is the reason why I didn't put tabs in the toolpath. I want to be able to double click that waist. Then I want to come up here and hit an ortho view of the model, which is the one between Z and full screen here. Just hit the ortho view to kind of rock it back, zoom in a little bit. Now I can come over here and save a preview image to send to a client or send to somebody else who I need to get their approval of how this is going to look. Then click on Z, get a straight Z view, maybe zoom in a little bit more, click on Save Preview Image and save another image. When you click on this, it'll open a navigation window. You'll navigate to your folder and save it in that folder. I don't want to save this, is why I'm not doing that. Now, the only problem with this is I need to modify the profile toolpath. And because I've done two things, if I do undo last, it's just going to put the material back. Well, that's all well and good, but now I need to modify the profile toolpath to add tabs. I need to reset the preview everything. But that's okay, because I've got something else I need to do. I'll close the preview. When I go outside and work on my CNC machine, I set my X, Y, and Z zeros at the bottom left corner. Now, as I said, for layout purposes, my X, Y, and Z zero is right in the center. If we look back at the 2D view, my XY datum is the center of the material. Now's the time to change that. I can either go back over to the drawing toolpath, go into Job Setup and change it, or I can go over here to Set under Material Setup, and I can change it right here. I'm not going to do this because I'm also going to change the modeling resolution. So I'll go back to my drawing toolpath. We have figured this out and modeled this up in the 7 times slower, very high modeling resolution. I want to increase that resolution because I have a couple of models together combined with some text here. So again, to get to those higher resolutions in Job Setup, I'm going to hold down Shift, click Job Setup. Now I can change my XY datum to the bottom left, and we see there it did change. And I can change my modeling resolution. Again, I'm going to choose 20 times slower, extremely high. I think that's more than sufficient enough. We do have some detail here, but we don't have so much that it really warrants going any higher than this. I'll click OK. Because I have made so many changes, my material setup values have changed. All toolpaths must be recalculated to ensure correct results. Would you like to recalculate now? Yes. So now it's going to go through and recalculate all of the toolpaths we had already applied. As an aside, you see down here that red X. If you get to a point to where you need to stop a toolpath calculation, you click that X and it will stop calculating the toolpath, let you go back and make corrections. It's now giving me the warning as it's recalculating the profile toolpath. It's warning me the tool will cut through the material. I want it to, so I click OK. All toolpaths successfully recalculated. OK. Center the model here. Center a project, rather. Go back over to the Toolpaths tab. I'm going to click on the preview. Make sure that I have all of my toolpaths in the correct order, and they are. Profile, always the last toolpath on the list. It's the last thing you want to do. We will go back into the Profile toolpath and we'll add tabs. So, double click on the Profile toolpath. I'm not going to change anything up here. I am going to add tabs. I'm going to use 3D tabs. They're going to be 1/2 inch long, 1/4 inch thick, maybe a little bit thick, but that's okay. And I'll edit tabs. I want to place, let's place one up here at the top center. Place one over here at about 3 o'clock. Place one down here at about 6. Place one over here at about 9. That's good enough. They don't have to be spot on perfect. I've got it held in place with some pretty good sized tabs. I can close this. Calculate that toolpath. I know it's going to cut through the material. Click OK. Now I'll preview all toolpaths. Okay. And there's our project as it's finished. Now again, you see I have the tabs here. And that's why I calculated that profile toolpath without tabs first, so I could save preview images without this scrap material. Now if I tried to double click to get rid of the waste, it would eliminate the entire model because this is still seen as one piece of material. There is no waste material to eliminate. There's our model. We can save G-code, take it outside, and start cutting. A couple of pointers I'll give you before we close this video out. When you first set up your material in Job Setup, try to use the least amount of material possible. What I mean by that is, you saw how using the zero plane converts the entire surface of this to part of the 3D model. The smaller this is, that'll still allow you to get your model out of it, obviously. The smaller this is, the less time it's going to take to machine that. So try to size the material to fit the model. This is actually a little bit big. I probably could have made my material a ½ inch smaller, which would have saved me a few minutes of calculating time and might save a little bit of machining time. If you have a machine big enough to mount a 4x8 sheet of material on it, don't enter a 4x8 sheet of material and then try to cut a 12x12 model. It will figure the entire sheet of material. So no matter how big the material is, try to size the material and job setup close to the size of your final model. That'll save you a lot of time, save you a lot of headache. So to briefly recap what we have here, we imported 2 models from the Vectric Clipart library, converted one from a dome to a dish, then applied the second one as allowing the relief to project upward from that dish. We added some text, applied that text to a curve, then calculated the toolpath projecting that text onto the 3D model. We then calculated a toolpath without tabs, saved preview images, recalculated the toolpath to include tabs, then changed our XY datum point. I know that was a lot to take in, and I do apologize for the length of this video. But we've gone from the very basic to some pretty advanced stuff here. And in the next video, we'll get into importing a model, an STL file that was created in another software program. So I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up down below. If you'd like to continue to follow this series, or follow along with my other CNC adventures, or my laser adventures, I do hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. As usual, whether you subscribe to my channel or not, I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and y'all take care.